Hello and welcome to the Freakish Lemon video podcast. I am your host, the Freakish Lemon. I go by Adrian and I use masculine pronouns. Welcome to any new viewers. Thank you so much for clicking on whatever you clicked on to get here. And welcome back any returning viewers. Thank you so much for following along with this thing that I do. This is a crafty type podcast coming to you from the Northwest Hills of Connecticut, and show notes for this episode and all episodes can be found at my website at freakishlemon.com or freakishlemonpodcast.com. We have a group on Ravelry. Just search Freakish Lemon in the groups tab and you will find us, and you can follow me at all the fun places as Freakish Lemon, like Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and Ravelry. And show notes, or not, bleh. Links to all the things that I've just talked about will be in the down bar here on YouTube or somewhere around here if you're watching this somewhere else. And please remember to subscribe here on YouTube if you'd like to follow along with what I am doing and be notified that that's happening on this particular platform. Yeah. That was the end of the spiel. You'd think I'd have gotten this down by now, but no. So we start this podcast off with a little bit of podcast stuff. Just a reminder that the 2018 blanket make-along is still happening over in the Ravelry group. So if you are making a blanket of whatever craft and you'd like to share some progress or ask some questions or need some encouragement, come join us over at that thread. It's kind of a slow and steady thread, but there's some great blankets being worked on, and everybody who's participating is really great about encouraging or answering questions if you have any. Also, we're currently in our half-square triangle quilt-along. This is a quilt-along that's going from March to the end of September, where we're making quilts that have half-square triangles. All the details are over in the thread on Ravelry if you'd like to find out more. And please come join us. If you've never made a quilt before, this is a pretty easy, I'd say it's a pretty basic patterning, and you know, feel free to come ask questions in the thread. There's only a few of us participating, but everybody who is participating seems to be really excited about getting some quilting time in. So this podcast starts off with life stuff. It's been like another 3 or 4 weeks since my last episode because I've been terrible about time management. But one of the things that kind of threw me off there, where there was a week and a half where I was temporarily filling in for my supervisor who was on vacation, so I was doing her job and my job, which meant that there was zero energy to do anything at all. It was just come home and read and sleep. That was it. Which is rough and kind of annoying. But after the supervisor came back, I went on I say day trip, but it was basically an hour drive, an hour in the museum, and an hour drive back. But I went on a day trip with Gabby, who's my sister, Once Upon a Corgi, and her friend Margaret. We went out to the Wadsworth Athenaeum Museum, which is an art museum in Hartford. It's like a 5-minute walk from where I work, but I haven't been there in many years. But they had a Gorey's World exhibit for the artist Edward Gorey, which we wanted to check out. We were only there for an hour because we decided to take advantage of the museum has admission for free from 4 to 5, which is their closing hour. The hour before closing, Wednesday through Sunday, so we figured we'd go in for free. Didn't just because the exhibit would be gone by the time it was a free weekend. I think every second weekend in the month, or maybe second Saturday in the month, I don't know. But if you're interested in going to the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut, their website has all the information you need about admission and free days and all that kind of stuff. We actually did a few things in that hour. We went on a kind of mini art tour where this guide went through 3 specific pieces of art, which was interesting. It was one of those tours where she basically provided some information and then asked the group their interpretations of pieces of the art, which is not really any of our favorite style of tour guide type stuff. But we did get to see some really interesting pieces of art. And we quickly went around this exhibit in the Wadsworth, the Cabinet of Art and Curiosity, which is a really interesting room that's just like filled with some kind of weird stuff in there. There's some kind of strange antiques, some strange artwork, and there's natural history specimens and drawers, so there's like fossils and those kinds of things. It's a really interesting room to go poke around in. There's this really cool piece of artwork where head on it looks like it's a classical painting that's been like glitched, but if you come around from the side and like stare down the side of it, it looks like a normal painting. It's very, very neat. We didn't spend a whole lot of time in there, but they had a pamphlet, and I definitely want to go back and check that out some more. And then we went through the Gory's World exhibit, which was really cool. I like the layout that they had. It was kind of like a winding path through. There was a lot of his drawings. They had 2 of his fur coats that were suspended in midair, like posed, which was really cool. And there was also a lot of art from Edward Gorey's personal collection that was inspiring to him. So that was really neat. There was a short film. I don't remember what the film was called, but it was playing on a projector in the middle of this room, and you could go on either side of it and see the short animated film of his work. It's definitely worth checking out if you're into that kind of gothic line drawing art style of his. If you're unfamiliar with his work, I would recommend doing a Google search to see if that's something that you would be interested in if an exhibit of his work is coming to somewhere near you. So that was pretty cool. And then last weekend was a very busy Saturday. The first thing I did that Saturday was Connecticut Sheep and Wool. The Connecticut Sheep and Wool Festival in Vernon, Connecticut. It's a brilliant little show, and I love going. I usually don't spend a whole lot of time there because it coincides with another thing that I have planned every year. But it's a very well curated show. There's not a lot of vendors, but every single vendor is quality. Every single one is worth going into and checking out their wares. Gabby was there with a Once Upon a Corgi booth, which of course I loitered at for a while. But yeah, it was really nice to go through it. I didn't end up buying any yarn. I did make one purchase, but I did collect a couple of business cards for vendors that I want to check out, look into more detail later. I'm trying to curb back on buying single skeins of yarn, and I want to make more sweaters, but I have several sweaters quantities in my craft room right now that are taking up way too much space, so I didn't end up buying any sweaters quantities, but I did collect business cards for 2 of the vendors that I'm definitely interested in purchasing a sweaters quantity from. And the first is Twist of Fate Spinnery, which is a local Connecticut mill. And I think I've talked about them before. Gabby's bought roving from them before. And I did have a feel of some of their yarns, which some of them are intriguing to me, and I do want to look into getting a sweaters quantity. But I also wanted to grab their business card because I may contact them to see if it's possible to get coned yarn from them, since they are a mill, since they are doing all the spinning of that yarn. If it would be possible to get cones of yarn for a sweaters quantity, which is really good for machine knitting because there's fewer ends to weave in, because you can go through a lot of yarn very quickly on a knitting machine, and the cone feeds into the knitting machine very well. So I picked up their business card, and then I'm sure I've seen these folks before in past years here, but I feel like I've seen them in other places too. But it's Prado de Lana. It's not focusing. Let me get my face out of the way. Sheep Farm. Let me pull this. It's their website, but there's also a QR code if you want to grab a picture of that real quick. They had a really compelling booth. They had, I don't know how many, but it was like rows of cubbies. And each cubby had a tag with the sheep and the information about that single sheep. And the only thing in that cubby was yarn made from fleeces from that one sheep. So that was really cool and is a great way to kind of get into the more natural fibers and see the range of colors that you can get just from natural sheep fleeces, and makes it really easy if you do want to buy a sweaters quantity, because you can buy all the yarn that you need from that single sheep if there's enough skeins of yarn. That one will be an investment because they are an independent farm, so it's a little more expensive because they are raising the sheep, they are having the yarn milled and all that kind of stuff. But I really liked all of the yarns that I touched in there, and you know, when I can get through some other sweaters quantities, I'll definitely be looking at getting some more yarn from them, because they had some beautiful, beautiful wools. And then the only purchase I did make was from these folks, Flatland Alpacas. I think they had 2 booths, but they had one booth that was just indigo dyed shibori cotton, and I bought a set of napkins, as this tag says. I'll throw some photos up here of what those napkins look like from their website. Mine are kind of crumpled into my lunch bag right now. So they're not exactly the most photogenic, but but they had some really beautiful, beautifully dyed cotton products in that booth. And they've got a bunch of other things on their website for sale, mostly alpaca based things, but definitely check out their indigo dyed cotton if you are interested in those kinds of products. Then after a couple of hours at Connecticut Sheep and Wool, I scooted out to an International Tabletop Day party. April the 28th is International Tabletop Game Day. It has coincided with Connecticut Sheep and Wool for 3 or 4 years now. So I went to my friend's house and we played a bunch of board games, and it was great. We like to play new board games. Some of them were ones that other folks there had played before, but they were all new to me, and they were all really interesting, different games. The first game we played was called Codenames, and it's a team game in teams of 2 and it's kind of a word association guessing game. You have to kind of direct your partner to guess the right words on a board, which is really fun. And then we played Joking Hazard, which is a game not safe for work or mixed company if it will make people uncomfortable. It's from the creators of the webcomic Cyanide and Happiness, so if you're familiar at all with that comic, it's very much like that. And the goal of this card game is players take turns being a judge, and the judge has to draw a card, which is the first panel of a comic. They choose another card to be the second panel of the comic, and the other players have to take a card from their hand to make the funniest or the grossest or the weirdest 3-panel comic, and the judge determines who wins that round. It's a very fun game, and you get some real weird, like real grotesque humor out of that game, which we all thought was hilarious. And then we played another card game called Red Flag, and it's a similar play style to Joking Hazard, where you have a hand of cards and somebody takes turns being the judge. And in this case, the judge was a single person looking for a date, and each player had to draw cards from their hand for 2 attributes to make a good date for the judge. And then you would draw a red flag card to play and sabotage the player to your left. So you might have a hand that, you know, they're a millionaire and they own beachfront property, but the person sabotaging you will throw down a card saying something like they will always have bad onion breath or something ridiculous like that. And the judge picks the best date out of the group. So that was surprisingly fun. You get some really awkward red flags in that game. But we played it for a while and it was pretty fun. And then the last game we played for a long time. We actually didn't end up playing the game that we had intended to play because we had a whole bunch of fun with this game, and it was getting late by the time we stopped playing this. Well, it was really late by the time we stopped playing this game, but it's a game called Wits and Wagers, and it's a trivia game. Each card has a question with a numerical answer. So it'll say, how long is the longest highway in the United States? I-90. And each player has a little board and they write down a number, a guess, mostly. A lot of those trivia questions are not stuff that the average person would know. So you'd write down a guess, and then we'd arrange the guess from lowest to highest on a felt board, and you would bet poker chips on which answers you felt were closest without going over. It was really, really fun and really interesting to like hear the answers to these questions, and it never made anybody feel bad about knowing the answer because you could be wildly off. Like there was one about the price of the highest sold, or the highest dollar amount for a painting sold at auction, and we were all millions of dollars under. And we're like, oh, I don't feel so bad now, because, or like, we'll just, like, if you had no idea, you just pick a random number and just put it down. It was really, really fun to play, and that's when I think that anybody can pick up pretty quickly, and it's fun to learn as you make these wild guesses. And that's really it for life stuff. That's a lot of life stuff. I usually don't have that much, but yeah, I had a lot of things going on the past few weeks, but it was super fun. So let's get into some crafty things now. So finished objects. I have a couple of finished objects this week, which is great. I finished the scrap yarn woven pillow covers. I've talked about these before, but I had some weaving done with scrap yarn that I put together. I sewed them together on my sewing machine, and they're interfaced and all this. So I have 2 of these round pillows with this scrap yarn. And I did the backs, oh, there's dog hair all over them, with some of the plaid that I dyed blue. I had initially thought to put a zipper in the pillow cover, but that really didn't look good at all, and I ended up ripping them both out and just hand stitching them shut. But one of the problems I ran into was both of these pillow forms. I believe I had overstuffed them for a previous project, so they were massively fat pillows. So I had to unstuff them, and then I had all this junk stuffing left over. So I took another piece of this blue fabric, cut out a couple of squares, and made just a square pillow with the extra stuffing. Like, this is how much extra stuffing was in these 2 circular pillows. It was ridiculous. So now each of my chairs down in the craft room has a square pillow to sit on and a round pillow to place behind you if you need it. Or if I need it, because I'm really the only one sitting down there. Unless Gabby's over and she's using the table for something. But yeah, I'm very pleased with how these pillows turned out. This is... If you have a smaller rigid heddle loom, this is a pretty great project to do. Because I just warped the loom fully, and then this one's a better example because it's the same weave. Just sewed them together, pressed the seam flat, and top stitched down the seam after I had interfaced them. And you can get some really interesting pillows, I think. Especially if you did a plain weave all in the same color. Like, you wouldn't even notice, I think, this seam if it was all the same color. So that's really cool. So that's 3 finished objects. 3 pillows. And then a big finished object. I finished a quilt. Not the half square triangle quilt for the quilt along, but the weather has turned and I've had to remove blankets from my bed, so I have put in a lot of time and energy into my winter wall quilt, which I'm gonna try and retrieve without knocking over this little tray table that it's on. So here is, it's very heavy. Here is my winter wall quilt, and I will give you a summary of all the things involved in this quilt. So the winter wall quilt is a pattern from a book called The Weekend Quilter, which is a Reader's Digest publication. It's got this kind of brick wall motif. All of the rectangles are pieced from scrap clothing fabric and scrap quilting fabric. It's all reclaimed from old clothes or my stash or just kind of general family fabric stash. The border, this blue border, is taken from an old fitted bed sheet for my old bed. The elastic had completely worn out, but the majority of the fabric was still good, so I cut that into strips for this border. The back is this black cotton, which attracts dog hair like nobody's business, but I'm just gonna have to live with that. But this was a destash from somebody who contacted me on Instagram and sent me about 9 yards of black cotton. So it's 2 pieces of that seamed up the middle. And then I opted to tie this quilt because it's huge and thick and heavy, and I didn't want to machine quilt it. So it is tied with 3 strands of embroidery floss. It's just DMC floss in the ecru color. And I tied it on each of the vertical lines, and then once kind of following where the previous tie was, kind of in the midpoint of the border. I did spray baste this quilt, but I also pin basted this quilt just because it was so heavy and so big. And mostly took over the dining room table to tie the quilt, because that was really the best place to put it, where it wouldn't be in every single person's way. What else? Spray basted, pinned, tied with the floss. And then I did this flanged binding for the first time. It's, this blue is some blue fabric that I dyed as part of my fabric dyeing experiment, and this black cotton is some more of the same black cotton that I took from some of the trimming. And this binding was actually really easy to do. It's a little more time consuming because you have to get 2 different colored strips. So the black was 1 1/4 inches and the blue was 1 1/2 inches. Seamed together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then pressed flat so that the raw edges met up together. You sew on the back first, so the raw edge is pointing to the edge of the quilt, and then fold over, and then you do kind of a top stitch along, wow, that's a lot of dog hair, along where the flange and the binding meet. It's not my best work because I always rush on bindings, always, because I just want the quilt to be done. But this is actually a lot neater than a lot of my previous ones. Just regular binding, because on the back it's less noticeable, but it's kind of a mess to get everything tacked down properly when I'm hand sewing that. But this actually works really nicely, and you know, as I improve and practice, it would be really cool to do like a contrasting thread on that flange one day. Like, that would be super cool. But for my first one, it's really not bad. There were a couple of points where I ended up stitching over the black, and I went back and then ripped out what had gone awry. But overall, I am very pleased with this quilt. It's ginormous and heavy because so much of it is denim, but I'm super excited to have it done. I feel like I've been working on this for a million years, but it's done and it looks great, even if it's covered in dog hair, and I'm very excited to put this on the bed. So on to works in progress. I have been putting a lot of work into my Tramontane sweater, which is a custom fit pattern by Amy Herzog. This is in my own handspun and some Classic Elite Yarns Mohawk wool, and it is nearly finished. I have finished both sleeves. I have seamed the shoulder seams and the set-in sleeve part. I have done the ribbed collar trim, which needs blocking desperately, but I'm very happy with how that looks at the moment. I just need to do these last seams from the sleeve up to the underarm, down to the other cuff on either side. But after that, I just have to block it and cross your fingers that it fits. But I'm very pleased with how this has turned out. I've actually managed to get most of these stripes to seam up properly. Some of them are kind of like a half stitch off with them, which I'm not fussed about because you'll barely be able to tell when it's on a human body. But I just love how this is looking. I can't wait to finish it. You know, just in time for it to be 80 degrees and awful. So I hate summer, but it's rapidly approaching. But that is nearly done and I'm so pleased. And then I have been working on a new woven scarf. I'm calling it the Last Son of Krypton scarf because that's what I called that hand spun. I'm using the 12 dent heddle for fingering weight yarns, and it's warped with fingering weight yarns in vertical stripes. In a sort of, there's red stripes and 2 different blue stripes, and I am weaving it with hand spun, very old hand spun, some of my first hand spun that I called the Last Son of Krypton, and it's just a plain weave. I had done a panel in my kind of blanket shawl thing, very similar to this, and I really, really liked that, and I had a ton of hand spun left over, so I figured I'd make a scarf pretty much mimicking a similar pattern to what I wove for that thing. So, been putting on some time in that. I've also been swatching since things have come off of the knitting machine. I did a multi-swatch for a whole bunch of different things. So the first thing I did, I started the swatch with a hung hem, which basically means that you knit a certain number of rows and then you take your live cast on stitches and put them up on the needles and knit them together, which I think looks really nice. I wanted to see what it would be like in a heavier weight yarn, because I have seen them turn out very nicely in fingering weight and sport weight yarns, but for my next LK 150 sweater, I don't want to fuss around with the ribbing, so I wanted to see what this would be like in a thicker yarn, and it's nice. I do like it. And then I did a tuck stitch pattern just to play around with tuck stitches. And for tuck stitches, the right side is actually the purl side of the work. So I basically pulled some needles out of work, slipped those needles for 3 rows, and then tucked up those 3 rows of slip stitches. You can see there is a row here where I kind of miscounted and screwed it up. But again, that's a really, I had never done tuck stitch patterning before, so I figured I'd try a simple one and see how that looks. I think I'm gonna use this as a gauge swatch and do a hat with this pattern in a red yarn that I have. So that's really cool. And then I don't know what you would call this. I don't know if it's a fisherman's rib or a half fisherman's rib or English rib or the differences between any of those. But basically I did a, what is it, 3x1? Yeah, 3x1 rib. But instead of latching up every purl stitch, I latched up every other purl stitch. So you get a, alright, focus. You get a tucked rib stitch. You can see, I don't know if you can see, but there's every other row, it's just a slip stitch that gets caught up in the previous row, which takes a lot less time and actually does look really nice from the right side. But I don't know what that's technically called. I haven't had a chance to look it up yet. And then I did a section where I did one side with slip stitch rows to see if that would control the curl of the stockinette, because stockinette curls in, but it didn't really. So now I know. But that is a really nice looking slip stitch pattern there. And then, what else did I do? I did some more slip stitch patterning, which you can see on the front. This one you can see, which looks really nice. But the back also looks really nice as well. And then this one, it's another slip stitch, kind of alternating. But you can't really tell that that's really happening there on the front. It's very subtle. It would probably show up in a more variegated yarn here, but for a tonal yarn, your patterning is kind of on the purl side. And then I did a knit-on border. This half is knitting it on every other row of the purple, and this half is knitting it on every row of the purple, which is the way that looks better to me. This one kind of flares out a little, so if I were doing this knit-on border on a shawl, I might want that, but if I'm going to knit on a border for, say, a cardigan, say like a knit-on button band, this is the side I'm going to want to use. And this was just a 3-stitch border with 1 stockinette stitch and then a 2-stitch twist, which you can't really see because it's, I don't know, these colors just kind of don't really lend them to doing that, but it curls less. It's a pretty straight edge. It's not curling back in on itself terribly much. So that's one swatch. Played around with a lot of techniques. I love doing these kind of exploratory swatches. And then I did another swatch for a technique called knit weave, which is possible to do by hand, but I don't know if I've ever seen anybody do it by hand. But it's really easy to do on the knitting machine. So this is the stockinette side of the swatch. But this is the reverse stockinette side of the swatch. And I did a couple of different different ways of alternating and how many needles it went over. But basically, you take a second yarn, which I took this green cotton, and you weave over, under, the needles. And then when you knit the needles up, the knitting kind of locks in that weave, which is really interesting, and I think an interesting way to use other yarns that may not work in your knitting machine as well. I don't know if this cotton would work well in my knitting machine, but cotton doesn't have a lot of stretch in it. So if it did cause a problem, this is a way to use cotton. You can also use yarns that are much bigger than what your machine can knit. So I could use a super bulky yarn, so long as my tension for the knitting is large enough to go over the super bulky yarn. And most of these, it isn't seen on the front, or if it is seen, it's seen very little. This one, they just kind of aligned in such a way that you can see it. But that's pretty cool. And then I got to swatching for my next sweater that's going to go on the LK150 using the Lion brand Scarfy yarn. So I did a couple of swatches, 40 stitches by 40 rows, to measure out. I think this is the fabric that I like the best. It's the largest dial tension that I swatched for, which was dial 8 on the LK150. And yeah, I used some techniques that's talked about by, I can't remember her name, but the host of the Handy Machine Knitting podcast. She had an episode a couple of months ago where she talked about swatching, and I looked up a blog post by Susan Guayumi, who's a knitting machine guru, about the best way to swatch for your knitting machine. And this was a technique that they both discussed, where you cast on 40 stitches, and at the 30 stitch marks, so 5 stitches in on either side, every 10 rows put a little marker, so that you have 3 places to measure your stitch gauge from, and then you do 40 rows, so you have plenty to measure your row gauge from. And I can't remember which one of them, or if both of them said it, but I kept the waste yarn on. Previous swatches I have cast them on and cast them off in such a way so that the waste yarn was not a part of it, but I can't remember which one talked about it. But if you leave the waste yarn in, then you don't get any distortion from your first row or your last row. And it's actually the other way around. This is a cast on edge. So, so all the distortion is happening in the waste yarn. So all of your sample yarn is just straight stockinette. I haven't actually measured these for gauge yet, but I really enjoyed swatching for them on my knitting machine. I love swatching on the knitting machine. It's so fun. Like, these 3 swatches took me probably a half an hour to knit up, because the hardest part was just getting the waste yarn cast on, making sure I could count, you know, putting in those little markers. Like this one, you can see my little markers kind of went all over the place. There's one there where it's supposed to be, and then they just kept coming in. I don't know what happened. But, yeah, so I'm excited to start this project. I do have to do some math for this, other than the normal, gauge. I'm going to be using the sweater blank from Renee Callahan, but I want to put the medium-sized neck on the large-size pattern, so I have to finagle with that a little bit, which shouldn't be hard. The blank kind of walks you through all the different pieces. I just got to figure out which parts of the worksheet correspond to the depth of the neck and the width of the shoulders and all that. So that's fun. And those are my only swatches thus far. New stuff. I have made one yarny purchase that has made it into the house to talk about, and that is a KR850E ribber attachment to go with my Brother knitting machine. The Brother knitting machine is not yet up and running. It is still, I still need to clean the plastic, I still need to change the sponge bar, and I need to clean out, I think probably next weekend, I'll be removing the carriage from its Marvel Mystery Oil bath, and cleaning that up. So nearly there, but I saw a pretty good listing for a ribber for my knitting machine, so I bought it. It did show up missing a couple of pieces, 2 of which I don't really care about, but 2 of the pieces are, sorry, knocked into the tripod, are necessary to hook up the machine to my knitting machine. But I contacted the eBay seller and they have already mailed out the pieces I was missing, so positive experience overall. I don't know if I have to do any restoration work on it. I might have to lubricate the carriage and the needles, but I don't know if there's anything else I need to do to get it in tip-top shape. So that's something I'll be looking into over the next week or two. Which finishes up all the crafty stuff and is going to move us on to other stuff. Stuff I am playing. I've been playing a bunch of point-and-click video games recently. I think I talked about a few of them on my last podcast, but I purchased the Daymare Town series. It's a point-and-click game. It's kind of like Escape the Room, but Escape the Town. And the game is completely done in line drawings, which is really compelling. It's like clicking through a creepy children's book. I bought the complete collection for $14 US, which is not much at all. You get 8 games. They're relatively short games, but you get 8 of them. And I think they're $2 or $3 each. So I'm having a lot of fun with them. I'll start the game and click around on my own first to see what I can figure out. And the games are short enough that if I can't figure it out, I will quit the game, start it over, and pull up a walkthrough and follow the walkthrough and see how the game is intended to go. Which is really fun and something that I enjoy. And then stuff I am watching. I don't think I mentioned this in my last podcast, but I'm pretty sure I saw this movie before my last podcast, but Pacific Rim 2 was really good. And then since then, I went and saw Avengers Infinity Wars. I won't be saying anything spoilery, because I don't like to spoil people on movies, and I know a lot of people have seen it, but I'm still not sure how I feel about that movie. I think it's a movie that I will get a better idea of how much I liked this story once we're a few more movies in. I think because we've got Ant-Man and the Wasp coming out later this year, and there's another Avengers movie. And I think once we get a couple movies in, so I can see how this fits into the overall storyline, I think I'll have a better idea of how much I did or didn't like it, but it was a very surprising movie. And then I finally started season 2 of Jessica Jones. I don't know what was going on, but a bunch of stuff did season 2s on Netflix, and I just they were completely off my radar. I had no idea. So finally started season 2 of Jessica Jones, which I am enjoying so far. And lots of podcast catch up, because I'm way behind. I'm about a month behind on everything. Stuff I'm listening to. I'm re-listening to Heir to the Empire, which is the first book of the Thrawn trilogy, which is a Star Wars book by Timothy Zahn and Mark Thompson. I will probably be talking about more audiobooks coming up, because the boss said it was okay for us to listen to our headphones at work again, finally. My department was the only department that was not allowed to do this. But the boss said it was okay, so I made a huge dent in that Friday, when I was just kind of had one earbud in, listening to Heir to the Empire and just working. It was great. And I also started a new podcast, an audio podcast called The White Vault. And their summary is: explore the far reaches of the world's horror in the audio drama podcast, The White Vault. Follow the collected records of a repair team sent to Outpost Freestead in the vast white wastes of the Arctic Circle, and unravel what lies waiting in the ice below. This is really compelling. It's kind of found footage style podcast. Found footage plus Arctic locale is always compelling to me. It is a bit slow to get into the what's turning out to be kind of horror or mysterious elements, but I think it's a great way to get you into understanding who these people are. It's an international cast, both in the actors and the characters that they are playing. I think the actors are all the nationalities of the characters they're playing. So there's... No, I'm completely blanking now. But it's really, really interesting to listen to and really compelling. And I just kind of listened to all available episodes straight through in a couple of days. So definitely recommend it if you're into found footage horror type podcasts. And then stuff I'm reading. Nothing new on the book front, but I have read some really compelling new fanfic series because I read fanfic constantly. So I'm going to talk about 3 series today. The first series is called The Red Past by Teruviel, and the summary is: hanging below the Cloud City, in shock and pain, abandoned by friends dead and alive alike, Luke Skywalker knew better than to ask for help for the 3rd time. He begged for understanding instead. The Force heard. So this is end of Empire Strikes Back. Luke gets transported back in time to the days of the Republic. Anakin is a young teen. He's like 14, I think, in this timeline. And there's not yet much interaction between Luke and Anakin, but it's really, really compelling because this is Luke at his angriest, when he's hurt and feeling betrayed and he's physically injured and has to relearn his life because of this new disability that he has. And he's been transported back to the height of the Republic's corruption and hypocrisy. They're 5 years away from the Clone Wars-ish. Like, this is prime, like, condescending core worlder nonsense. And Luke, who's an Outer Rim farmer turned rebel, is just not having it. He ends up being mentored to Mace Windu, who's a pretty judgy fella from the extended universe works and what you see of him in the prequels. So Luke is constantly challenging the Order's rules. Why do these rules exist? What's the point in that if it's not helping anybody? And just kind of challenging, especially the counselors, and how they will turn a blind eye to suffering just because the Senate says it's none of their business. It's really, really compelling. And it's interesting to see Luke at a point in his life where he is just kind of bitter and angry and dealing with that. I think a lot of Luke's stories are kind of when he's past that, when he's hopeful and... I mean, he's always a good person who wants to help, but I think we don't see a lot of stories from this particular... Or I don't see a lot of stories from this particular time in his life when things seemed to be at their lowest. So yeah, really, really interesting. And I spent several days reading this next series, just straight through, and it's the Identity series by Madame Alexandra. And the summary is: a distress signal reaches Coruscant after the Empire's demise, claiming to be the beacon of Bail Organa. What would the reappearance of Leia's adoptive father mean for her life in a post-Return of the Jedi context? What would he think of Han Solo, and what could he tell her about the dark shadow of her heritage? It's an alternate universe, which provides a really interesting scientific approach to not even really time travel. Part of the thing was with the destruction of Alderaan, just the planet completely obliterated so suddenly, it warped gravitational fields, magnetic fields, all the space where it used to be just kind of turned into a space-time mess, and it was unsafe to fly ships there. So when they get this distress call and they see where it's originating from, they figure they have scientists put on, you know, to investigate, could this have happened? And what happened was there was a ship leaving Alderaan's atmosphere at the time that it exploded, and it basically got trapped in kind of like a time-space bubble for 5 years, because time and space around that area were so stirred up and in turmoil because of the sudden destruction of the planet. And on this ship was several Alderaanian refugees now, including Bail Organa, Winter Kelchu, who is another girl that the Organas adopted, and she and Leia were raised together, and one of Bail's sisters, I can't remember her name off the top of my head, but so Leia, post Return of the Jedi, with the setting up of a new galactic government, she's just coming down from the war. Like, she's just starting to see what her life might look like long term with Han and their relationship, with her relationship with Luke, and him trying to go forward with trying to set up a Jedi Order and the role of government and all this kind of stuff, suddenly faced with the reemergence of that grief for her lost planet, having to suddenly deal with the personal relationships that she had been mourning, and also the political fallout of her no longer possibly being the spokesperson for Alderaan, because her brother, or not her brother, her father, Bail, he was the senator for Alderaan, and he is, although Alderaan is matriarchal, he was of a higher rank than Leia at the time, and Leia was never coronated as Queen of Alderaan. So there's a lot of stuff to dig into, and it's really fascinating to see Leia's perspective of all of this happening, to see Han's perspective of all of this happening, to see Bail's perspective of all of this happening. Last he knew, Leia was on her way to get General Kenobi, and now it's 5 years later, and she knows the truth about where she comes from, and she knows her brother, and she has this man in her life that Bail has never met, and he doesn't understand their relationship because he's lived as a nobleman his whole life. He doesn't understand why this Corellian smuggler should appeal to his daughter in any way. It's really, really good, and it is a great... It really captures, I think, Leia's character, which I love to see. There is a warning, though, on this fic. There are, I think, 7 different fics in the series. The very last one, and it's appropriately tagged and warned and everything, but I just wanted you to be aware that the last fic mainly centers around a pregnancy and a miscarriage. It is not imperative that you read this portion of the series to kind of get the whole gist of it. So if that is something that you are avoiding for your own mental health, you can skip that last part of this series without a problem. And like I said, it is appropriately tagged. There are warnings on the fic for that portion of the fic, so that you can avoid it if you need to. And then the last fic I want to talk about is a series called Dominoes by Meridian Pony. And the summary is a little bit of a blurb from the fic, and then a summary. So the blurb goes, "So, we died." Heavy's voice was flat. "Yes, we died," Fives confirmed. Even though his hands are steady on Echo's shoulder, his voice trembles. "We all remember?" Everyone nods. Droidbait shudders and shuffles closer to Cut Up. "How is that possible?" he mutters. "We're not Jedi. We can't see the criffing future, whatever it was. We can't, it's just not possible. How could we have all had the same dream?" Domino Squad wakes up to find themselves back on Camino, hours from taking their final test. Except they remember passing the final test, and they each remember dying afterwards. So again, alternate universe time travel thing, this time with Domino Squad, which is a squad of 5 clone troopers from the Clone Wars TV show. And it's absolutely brilliant, and I'm really looking forward to more. It's, especially with this group, because most of them die relatively quickly after their first deployment, which, I mean, there's like 2 episodes where they all feature. 2 of their company do survive and go on to be a part of the greater story, especially Fives and Echo. So it's really compelling that all 5 of them wake up in the past, remembering their entire lives. So Fives and Echo have more context, Fives especially, because he supposedly was the last one to die. Turns out that wasn't the case, but oh, there's so much pain and sadness in the Clone Wars. But so Fives and Echo have more context for what they need to stop, but they don't know the end game. They don't know how this is all going to go down. None of them survived to see Order 66. And Cut Up, Droidbait, and Heavy didn't survive their first deployment. It's also really interesting to see 5 characters interacting with the Force and not being Force sensitive. The Force chose these 5 to go back in time, chose to show them their lives. And throughout the fic, like, if they're unsure of who to tell about what's happening, the Force nudges them, like, don't tell them yet. Absolutely say nothing to this person. You can trust them. And seeing the 5 of them not only struggle with being put back in time, having skills that they're not supposed to have yet because they're shinies, and them dealing with the Force steering their lives when they are not trained for that is really, really compelling. And I'm so excited to see where this fic goes. And that's it. That's it. 3 fics this week. So that's going to bring us to the end of this episode. Show notes and links to everything are over at freakishlemon.com. Come along to the Ravelry group. Just search Freakish Lemon in the groups chat, or the groups tab. Wow. Yeah. Freakish Lemon in the groups tab. Check out the 2018 blanket make-along. Check out the half square triangle quilt-along if you're interested in joining us for a quilt-along at all. Plenty of time to join, still. Several months. You can follow me as Freakish Lemon at all the fun places like Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and Ravelry. And all the links to these things will be in the down bar here on YouTube or somewhere around here if you're following, or if you're watching this somewhere else. And if you do want to follow along with what I do and want to know when these videos are being posted, consider hitting that subscribe button here on YouTube to follow along on this platform. And that is going to do it for now. Goodbye.